una puesta en escena absoluta from which they were not able to escape. However, and this is a distinctive mark of the Baroque ethos, this was achieved without fully sacrificing the natural form of things. Their use value without fully sacrificing the natural form of things, their use value in the interest of the economic value. So they managed to comply and transgress in the same maneuver. This state of affairs is believed to have persisted to the present in Latin America. And, in my opinion, Sarduys' non-teleological concept of language echoes Echeverria's Baroque ethos as an alternate standpoint to that of the status quo of imposed referentiality. Both the Cuban author's idiosyncratic aesthetic proposal and Teatro Ciervo's praxis of it symbolize a survival, or what's more, an exit strategy from what Echeverria calls a civilizing scheme. The exit strategy is also Echeverria's idea, of course. So they both are an exit strategy from what Echeverria calls a civilizing scheme, be it that of the paradoxical consumerism of literature that doesn't accept the use of language as fetish, or the intellectually constrained arena of Cuban affairs. But to me, the difference lies in that these modern players do not necessarily want to get out of their production. If the colonial Latin Americas couldn't get out and the system persists until today, these modern people don't necessarily want to get out. The Cuban troupe lives and breathes Sarduys' concept of the Baroque as an alternative to the selfishness and rationality that marks our times. In Nelda Castillo's words, it's a giving oneself, a lavishness, an attitude of utmost commitment. End of quote. A world of excess, of what Georges Bataille called expenditure without reserve, that climaxes in an eros poetics of literature. For the Cuban writer, quote, the entire Baroque is just a hyperbole whose prodigality is not erotic by mere chance. End of quote. Language and sex stop being representative. They must be taken as centripetal signifiers that exist for their own sake. The rapport of language and the body taken to its furthest and most ambiguous juxtapositions, a place where the pleasure of writing and the writing of pleasure culminate in a self-referential exhaustion of chiseled sentences. These are more or less his words. Actually, he called them epiphanias en filigrana, filigree epiphanies, as he called them, that close back into themselves. Quote, as in the Tibetan mandalas, he said, everything explodes from the genitals and reaches the hands. I used to write naked and at times would dance while looking for words until my body turned into language and the words on the page became a body, something tangible, tactile, that dances too and looks around. End of quote. Sarduys' work, then, is language that becomes a body, and his own body becomes the language on the page. Likewise, these actors' strenuous training enables them to become holistic vehicles of expressivity, as they have been described, and perform from a place of complete intellectual abandon where their bodies incarnate the thought to be conveyed. In a political system such as the Cuban that kept homosexuals in quarantine camps until the late 80s, a demographic that is still marginalized despite an ostensible attempt to the contrary, the dissidence and defiance of Sarduys' work, and by extension that of El Ciervo Encantado, is greatly increased by his homoerotic tendencies. In line with the import Sarduy confers to the signifier, transvestism is his most accurate metaphor for writing. For him, both transvestism and writing are processes not of imitation, but of simulation. That is, they refer not to an origin or form in the Platonic sense, but rather to figures of simulation in a chain of relative signs, all without exception artificially constructed. End quote. The transvestite does not imitate a woman, because a woman is just a cultural construction. It doesn't exist. For Sarduy, a woman is just appearance, however, and by extension, so is a country. So interesting, you were talking about the woman and country also. For Sarduys, both woman and country are, quote, signifiers in the order of simulacra. The literary aesthetic of the present Cuban political structure demands socially and politically committed realistic works and censors frivolous, decadent, and irreverent ones. Some of the members of Teatro Ciervo also float freely in the ambiguous member that is gender. Some of the members of Teatro Ciervo also float freely in the ambiguous medium that is gender. One reason why the troupe was ahead of the times in the early 90s in their audacity to inscribe Sarduys' work in and from their bodies as a need to express their status as other. In general, the troupe has not encountered major difficulties with the powers that be, but they are fully aware of an invariably low profile in terms of dissemination of their work by the official media. Lacan described psychoanalysis as discourse without words. Solers, on the other hand, views Sarduys' work as reverse analysis, that is, words without discourse. Indeed, Sarduys' texts render what he called radial reading, which you talked about, which he defined as, quote, a chain of signifiers which progresses metonymically and which finally circumscribes the absent, or the signified, tracing an orbit all around it, an orbit through the reading of which we can infer it. So it's not just that it's sort of going around and stuff, but an orbit through the reading of which we can actually should be able to infer it. Not necessarily should be able to, might. Teatro Ciervo is able to depict this function by performing on a round or nearly round stage at times. In addition, they frequently confer the same importance to each one of the elements in the show. The resulting visual, auditory, and mental disarray becomes a kind of radial reading, or radial watching, actually, backdrop of sorts that revolves around the empty center that for Sarduys is the censored word.